steady state for some reason. When I'm just cruising along, it's running lean. And I pull it apart, and this is what we've got here. So this guy was just barely hanging on by a thread when I pulled it out. Hey everybody, it's Adam again. Welcome back to my garage. So today I want to introduce my 1983 BMW 320i. It's an E21 body code, so that signifies that it was the early 3 Series, made from the mid-70s on up to 1983. Before I get into the history of this car and do a walk around of all the mods, I want to ask you to hit the subscribe button down below if you want to see more E21 content. And maybe leave a comment about what your favorite video you've seen so far on the channel is, whether it's the E36 content, my LS6 Sonoma, or this E21. And then I do have a Subaru STI I'll be introducing to the channel later this year. If you want to see more on that too, let me know. So a little bit of history about this car. I picked this car up in 2006, managed to talk the dealer down to selling it to me for $450. I was a college student at the time, didn't have much cash on hand, but I really wanted a rear-wheel drive 3 Series, older 3 Series, to tinker with. Because I had that Sonoma, I was autocrossing it, didn't want to break something on it. I'd rather break something on this car, not my daily driver, and very simple car to work on. These early BMWs are very, very easy to work on. And the parts, even at that time, relatively easy to find. So anyways, bought the car in 2006. Ran around with the M10 motor for 2 years after I got that running right finally. And then in 2008, I went ahead and I put an M42 in there. And we'll talk a little bit more about those modifications in a bit. So a little more background on why we're working on the car this week. I've got a bachelor party coming up here for one of my friends in Kentucky this weekend. And one of my other buddies locally around here said, hey, I'll go down there if you drive the BMW down there. So he and his brother are going to be joining with me. I can't even say that straight because it's such a crazy idea. They'll be joining me on the trip. It's about a 900-mile round trip from where we're at down to Louisville, Kentucky. And we're going to make the trek in this car. So there's a couple of things I've got to do before we have the car roadworthy. And I've only got a couple of nights to do it this week. So I'm going to bring you along for the ride as we go through it. All right, everybody, let's do a little walk around here. So let's start out with the brakes on it this time. Up in the front, we've got some Volvo 240 brake calipers. It's a 4-piston caliper on an early E21 vented rotor. And these are behind some clone BBS wheels, but 15x7s up front and 15x8s in the back. So a nice staggered setup. And I've got the springs set up so it's a real nice neutral feel on the track and on the autocross course. Get a little bit of throttle induced oversteer if I want to, and it plants real nice going through the turns. In the back, as far as the brakes go, put on 323i brake calipers and rotors in the back. Originally, this car came with drum brakes, and managed to find full rear subframe and disc brakes back about 10 years ago for the rear end on this. In the future, I plan on upgrading to E30 rear calipers. It's a little bit easier to find the pads and high-performance pad in the E30 model than it is to find on the E21 323i model. I can get the same pads up front for the Volvos, and really just getting it geared up for the next track day maybe later this summer or next year, where we can really push the brakes hard next time around. All right, let's talk about the fuel system a little bit. So in the trunk here, we've got a ATL well cell, and basically put this in when I finalized the E85 tune. Originally had the saddlebag tanks underneath the rear seat back there. Always had a leak up on top of the sending unit, and once I went to E85, decided to ditch the metal tanks so we didn't have to worry about rust, and just went with the ATL well cell here. So this is a 12-gallon tank. Fits real nicely down in there into the spare tire well. It's how they designed it. Got an in-tank pump, just a high-flow, low-pressure pump. Feeds up into this swirl tank over here. And then I've got a high-pressure, high-flow pump for the E85 to support the full E85 system. Also got a all-star fuel filter back here as well, in line with the in-tank pump, and helps keep the fuel clean coming out of there. Probably also noticed some special venting down in the corners here. Quite a bit of floorboard rot in the back of this. Really hasn't gotten bad over the last 15 years that I've owned the car, and it also makes for a nice aeration of the trunk lid here, the trunk area, so we don't get any mold or smells up in there. As far as the issue that I've got going on since last year, about a week after the track day last time around, started getting a pretty bad rattle up on the top of my shock towers back here. This mount up over here is pretty well shot. In fact, the rubber is basically gone in there, and I've got this this washer up on top of here banging up and down on top of the strut tower, and I'm going to be fixing those before we go on the trip here to Louisville this week. Eventually what I want to do is I want to take these that are blown out and put a Heim joint up at the top of those, basically like you see on the camber plates on a lot of these cars. I'll show you what I've got up front. I want to do the same thing in the back here with putting a Heim joint up there to get that rubber out of there. I'm also aware I've got a little bit of rust around the shock tower there on the edges. That's been there since I've had the car. Really have seen no propagation of the cracks or anything else. But someday when we make this into a serious track car with the cage and everything, we'll address that. But haven't seen the need to address it now. Also, compared to the stock E21, I relocated the battery to the back here just to help with the weight balance a little bit, as well as make more room for the turbo and everything else up front when I did the M42. All right, let's take a look under the hood. So as I mentioned earlier, it's got a M42 out of a 1991 318 IS. And basically this is the 1.8 liter. Really, it's the same base motor as what I've got in my E36 there. Different intake manifold, and it had different engine controller unit back when these were out on the E30s. But basically now what we're running is Megasquirt MS2 Extra for the engine controller unit. And then I put a bigger turbo on there that's a 0.63 AR turbine with a 0.5 AR compressor on it to really help the exhaust breathe a little bit better than what I had before. Back when I first did the turbo on this, I had a 0.48 AR both on the turbine and on the compressor side. Really helped with packaging, but at the upper end it seemed to choke it off a little bit. Ran about 198 rear wheel horsepower on octane 93 with that old setup, and now with this new setup on E85 we're over 250 horsepower, actually at 254 with the E85 tune, and on the same amount of boost, 14 pounds of boost, we get about 220 with octane 93 now. If you want to check out my dyno video, I'll put a link up in the corner and you can see how this fared on the dyno. As far as other things under the hood, so rather than just venting off the PCV through a filter to the atmosphere, I was getting a little bit of blow-by, a little bit of oil spray coming out of there when I was really running it hard. So I put this catch can on it back when I completed up the E85 tune, and then we've routed that back into the atmospheric intake there just to help provide a little bit of vacuum to basically suck the positive crankcase pressure through when we're running the engine. Really runs clean the way it does, and when I'm out there pushing it hard on the track or driving around doing autocross, after every couple of runs I'll go ahead and empty out. There's a valve on the bottom of here. I'll empty out whatever's inside of the PCV there, and basically we're good for another run. So up front here, We've got a intercooler back behind there, and basically it's a 2.5-inch aluminum line all the way through, all the charge pipes on this through this intercooler, and it really helps keep the temperatures down. Also, an added bonus is having it up in front of the radiator like that. When I turn on the fan when we're idling there, it'll draw some fresh air through the intercooler as well as cooling the motor through the radiator. It cools that intake air, so it's nice and cool when we take off on the line. But with the data logging and everything else, it pretty typically stays within about 10 degrees of ambient once we're moving, and that intercooler does the right job for us. So underneath the back of the car here, we've got the standard E21 limited slip diff. It's only got about 25% lockup from the factory, and this diff is probably pretty old now too, and it get a little worn out. So eventually we're going to add in some clutch discs to help increase that lockup a little bit more. And as I mentioned before, it's got that 323i rear disc brake setup on it. I also put a 320IS sway bar in the back. And again, the balance in the suspension, the way it's set up with the spring rates and the damping and everything else with the Bilstein Sports, really neutral, great handling car. And you know, you can push it past the limit and it doesn't snap like you see with the standard E21. You can really find the limit pretty easily with the car. Another thing worth mentioning, it's got a MagnaFlow exhaust on it here, basically a 2.5-inch back from the turbo all the way back through an aero resonator. And the exhaust note is really nice on this car. We'll talk a little bit more about how we routed the exhaust manifold to get a nice rumbly sound out of this. I'm a big fan of the Subaru Boxer engine, and a big thing about that Boxer engine is you get a nice rumbly sound because of how they mount the exhaust coming off the engine itself. Not ideal for efficiency and airflow, but in this case, really didn't affect the dyno all that much. We're pushing over 250 horsepower with this, but we've basically got a 1 to 3 and a 2 to 4 routing with this exhaust here, basically into a 2 to 1 collector up into the turbo there. And effectively what that does is it kind of gives you the bump on both sides as you're pushing through the exhaust, and it gives it a nice lopey sound. So this sounds like a little Subaru basically when it's going around the track. Some people, the purists on BMWs, I know everyone likes the 6-cylinder sound, and the M42 as a stock 4-cylinder really doesn't sound all that great. So anything we could do to make this sound a little bit lumpier, I'm all for that. Also have a mechanical boost controller on it down here. We'll probably put on an electronic boost controller at some point. Megasquirt 2 can support that, and that would allow me to dial it in the car from however I want. But right now, as it sits, basically when I go fill it up for gas, or if I'm going to go take it out for a track day, I go ahead and I adjust the boost however I want here. As you can see, 7th of July last year, we dialed it down to 9 PSI, and basically that's where she's been at ever since I put it away last year. When we dynoed it back at the middle of May, it was running at basically 14 PSI, and on the track day, the day after Memorial Day last year, we were down to 9, and I went ahead and I put it back up to 11, 14, and now we're back down at 9 PSI again, kind of in the daily driver mode. Another thing on this side of the motor is we did the coil on plug conversion back when I first did the turbo in 2012. Helped freed up a lot of space under the hood. Originally I had the stock E30 M42 coil pack sitting over there to the right, and basically had to do that to free up space for the turbo. I also notice, looks like one of my turbo bolts came out of there over the course of the winter, the last times I was driving it. So that's something else that we're going to have to work on before we take this out on the road this year. I put a super special yellow wrapped wire, goes all the way down to the E85 flex fuel sensor over there. With MS2 Extra, you can run it as a flex fuel system, but I wouldn't really recommend running it at the limit of boost and horsepower with that. I have seen some glitches where it'll drop to 0 or spike up to 100% ethanol, and you don't want it adjusting timing and fuel all that crazy when you're pushing it hard. So I pretty much limit the flex fuel sensor use only to seeing what kind of ethanol content I'm getting from the gas station, as well as if I've got a mix of E85 and octane 93 in there and I've just got to get down the road, I have it so it'll adjust the fuel and not the timing. I don't want it to all of a sudden bump timing up under boost and have something go through there where it thinks I've got a full 100% ethanol and bumps timing to the point of where I detonate it to death here. So I've got these camber plates on here. So these are ground control camber plates. Same brand as with the coilovers I've got in there too. You can't really see the coilovers up in there very well, but I've got a standard adjustable ground control coilovers with the IBAC springs, and then as I mentioned before, the Bilstein Sport shock and dampers in here. And on top of these camber plates here, there is actually a Heim joint or a spherical bearing up inside there. And rather than having the rubber bushings up on top of here, that spherical bearing helps stiffen it up quite a bit. And I don't have to worry about pushing through and poking a hole through my hood here. One other thing worth mentioning is this has got the standard 5-speed 318 IS transmission on it. I think that's the Grattan 240. And basically we've got a lightweight flywheel on it that's a M20 M42 hybrid flywheel, single mass from Racehead in Australia. It was about an 8-pound flywheel and put a spec stage 2 clutch on it for an M20 to help hold up to the horsepower that we're putting out with this M42. A little tough to drive around town and stop and go traffic. You really got to rev the motor up a little bit so you don't stall it when you're taking off. But man, you can really feel a difference in terms of just overall responsiveness in the driveline as you're going through the gears, and even when you're downshifting and doing speed matching with the heel toe. So that was another great addition we put on the car when we upgraded to E85 system. All right, now I want to talk about my favorite part of this car, the lovely, luxurious interior here. So I've got this Momo course seat that I bought off a buddy about 10 years ago for a good price, and she's seen a lot of work, and eventually I might have it recovered, but pretty much all the foam is gone in it. That'll be nice and comfortable for the 1,000-mile round trip we've got going down to Louisville. Also, one of the first mods I did on this car is I patched the floorboards up front here like any college student would do, just by riveting some steel, galvanized steel down to the floor. Seen other people use license plates for that, but didn't have the luxury of finding license plates wherever I could, and decided to do a little bit of riveting here. Also, a really important mod here, I've got a super large gas pedal. The BMWs typically have a hinged gas pedal that mounts to the floorboard. Well, you can see that's where I've got a patch. So that hinged gas pedal basically wasn't hinged on the floor anymore, and in order to get a nice heel-toe braking situation here, I put a nice wood grain laminated oak veneer pedal on there, and believe it or not, that's actually been on there probably since I did the M42 back in 2008. So that's held up real nice, and it's really comes in handy when we're doing the heel-toe downshifting. Also have some nice fresh air ventilation coming from the front here. All the HVAC was out of the car when I bought it, and really nasty. Also looking at this right now, I do need to do a little bit of wire tying up to keep some of the wires from hanging down underneath there when we're driving around this weekend. But basically, this is what the interior has looked like really since I've owned the car. I did put this center console back in here when I did the E85 setup. Originally, it was missing the center console, and I ended up going through all the parts that I got with the car that I never threw out over the last 15 years, and managed to find pieces for the center console. So put that in there to give it a nice OEM sort of rally look. And I've also got some switches up on top of here for launch control, and the flex sense for the E85 sensor here. Launch control trigger here as well. I'm going to wire that actually to the clutch pedal at some point. And then I've got the E85 map and the Octane 93 map. Sometime in the future, I'll uncover what that guy is there. Keep your eyes peeled on the channel and you'll find out more later. All right, let's talk about the gauge situation here. So anybody who's worked on their own cars or run Mega Squirt, anything like that, you want to get as much information as you can in, especially if you're new to the tuning world and trying to find all the little quirks and so forth that might not be working right, or something where your car, you might be running into some problem, have an advanced warning going down the road. So back when I did the turbo the first time in 2012, where all of the HVAC controls were up here. I put in a Z-Tronics data logger and a wideband there. So that runs basically the wideband as well as an EGT exhaust gas temperature sensor. I'm going to go ahead and turn the car on here just so we can look at all these gauges while they're on. And of course, we got the voltmeter right here. I always want to know if this guy's charging. And we've got our vacuum and boost gauge there as well. Oil pressure, and oddly enough, this car's got pretty good oil pressure for what we put it through and how many miles on it. Probably about 150,000 miles on this motor by now. And again, got the EGT sensor up inside here. And as you can see, as we're warming up, we're seeing that EGT sensor go up. That comes in handy when I'm cruising down the highway. If I look down and I see that thing is up around 1400, I know that I'm running lean and something's not going right. But typically at 70 miles an hour, we're between 12 and 1300 degrees Fahrenheit, and that seems to do pretty well for us. Super fancy tire pressure monitoring system here, and all four of the sensors still do work on the tires, and that's great for the autocross and track days. Just having a little at a glance down there, looking at the pressures and the temperatures, of course, to make sure I'm not pushing the tires too hard when I'm out on the course. Back behind here is the stock E21 gauge cluster, except for two different modifications. I fit VDO Vision Series tachometer as well as a speedometer in there. Back when I did the M42 setup, plugged right into the tachometer as far as the output from the ECU goes. Megasquirt went even better with it. And then, of course, without the cable-driven transmission speedometer, I had to go with inductive pickup on there. So I've got an inductive pickup for the speedometer there too. And another thing we're going to work on before we leave for the weekend here, ever since I did the fuel cell, I've got to go ahead and put in a sending unit to get that level reading right. Got one of those off of eBay, and we'll be installing that this week as well. So now for my second favorite part of the car, my first favorite being this nice wood pedal down here I showed earlier. With MS2 Extra and this ECU unit here, and this is a KDFI 1.4. So bought this from Europe, and actually that's in a Motronic form factor as well as a Motronic connection. So it's basically plug and play with the base MS2 tune on it, any early E30 BMW engine. I also got the Bluetooth module that goes with it because I had this wacky idea. I'm a big IndyCar guy. I like open wheel racing. And I wanted to have a digital dash on the steering wheel so I could look at all this data at a glance and even do data logging down there if I wanted to pull logs and read them later. So this is a tablet, an Android tablet. I ended up buying it used on eBay for 40 bucks. And it's got a Bluetooth connection that goes to my KDFI down there. And I can configure this gauge cluster however I want. And basically, I have it set up to have a shift light up on top of here. And then I've got the vacuum and boost. As far as the vacuum and boost indicator goes at the top there, when I'm at full boost, it's down here and it turns red. And lambda, AFR, coolant temperature, intake air temperature, what map you're at, got the actual boost and the vacuum reading down there. Of course, the RPM, and then very, very important to having the time of day down there. Also, we've got some historical traces on here as well. So this is RPM, and then I've got the lambda up top there. So if I want to do a little at a glance with looking at where the RPM and the lambda ends up, basically I can look at this when I'm driving down the road. Right now you'll notice the AFR and lambda really didn't move from 14.8 when I revved it up there. I think my 10-year-old wideband sensor is starting to go on it, so it looks like it didn't take this time around. So when we're on the trip here to Louisville this week, I will be watching that EGT temperature pretty closely going down the highway, just to make sure that we're not running it too warm, and hopefully my my wideband will snap out of it at some point while we're driving on the road. We've got this nice wooden Momo steering wheel on here. I've got that from Japan. And this was the fastest shipment I have ever gotten off eBay, I swear. I ordered it on a Monday or a Tuesday, and it was at my doorstep on Thursday. It was insane. It literally got to me overnight from Japan. When we go on the trip down to Louisville, probably not going to have this digital dash on here. just because I want it to look real nice. I want to get my horn button back on there. But basically, I'm going to remove these 3 screws here, remove the hub that I've got behind it, and then I'm going to snap back on my BMW emblem and horn there. So we got a nice non-distracted view when I'm driving down the road down to Louisville. There we go. So now my AFR and Lambda are reading good there. You go ahead and, when you rev it up and you let it come back down, you'll see that it locked up again on me. So another thing that E21 owners will recognize, I've got my super special hazard switch override down here with some zip ties on it. You've got to get this guy put right at the right height of depression there in order for pretty much all your electronics to work on this, whether it's your headlights, tail lights, blinkers, anything. They go through this godforsaken switch here, and you can't find them online anymore. If you do, you're going to pay out the nose for it, and you can go in and fix them. I've tried to fix mine a couple times, and I've just gotten to the point where I just let it hang down here. But basically, the blinkers and everything work fine, and my headlights all work fine as well. All right, now we're going to go to work on these rear shock tower mounts and get those out of the way first. And if we're lucky tonight, we'll get at the fuel cell and the fuel sending unit up inside there. And pretty much we'll be ready for a test drive at that point. So one of the benefits of having holes in the floorboard back here, when I was taking out one of the nuts up here, I thought it went back down into one of these crevices. Just so happened, I think it went through that little hole right there and ended up on the floor out here. So I didn't have to do much of a treasure hunt to go find it. We're going to go ahead and remove this shock now, and I'll show you why this was rattling in the back here. So up on the top here, there's supposed to be rubber bushing material that goes all the way around here. And basically what was happening, we're going down the road and you get this washer hitting on the metal part here, just clanking around in there. I'm gonna go grab the part I'm replacing it with. I'll show you what I'm talking about. So I bought this guy used. I'm hoping the fact that it's painted red doesn't mean red is bad, but at least this bushing looks like it's intact on here. Underneath it looks pretty healthy as well. But you can see, comparing it to what I pulled out of the car here, you've got rubber bushing material up the top there. You don't have it on here. Basically, it just chewed right through it and down to metal on metal contact there. So as soon as I pulled that shock right through there, basically that bushing fell right out. So as I mentioned before, it chewed it all up on top of here. This is more supposed to be hourglass shaped and pressed into the top of this guy here. And what I'm going to do with these, I'm going to hang on to these guys. And I'm going to work on putting a spherical bearing or a Heim joint up at the top of these. I'll weld it in there and then mount it up around the shock piston here and have some solid mount shock mounts in the future. I think really the only main reason why they've got a rubber bushing here, I mean, obviously it helps with noise and things like that, but you do get some misalignment to where this bushing wants to do this inside there as the suspension's articulating. So just like on the front, like I said before, we'll go with a spherical bearing on this guy long term. I think we'll get one to fit right nice down in there. We'll find one that fits around the piston real nice and tight there, and we'll have a nice tight rear shock mount system once we get that in the future. Stop there for a second, buddy. There you go. Now lift it up again. There you go. Oh. You know, I can sit here and boast all I want about rust holes being a nice way for bolts to fall down or nuts to fall down and out of the car. But as I'm putting this one on, I managed to have one fall down and go behind the battery there. So we're going to have to dig in behind the battery and see where that nut went. And there she is right there. So we've got the new bushings in the back there. We're going to give it a nice test here. No more clunks. She's ready to rock this weekend. Next up, we're going to work on the fuel pump and get the new fuel level sender in there. Your hands are all dirty. Inside here, where we had the original access for the in-tank pump and the original sending unit, we've got this coming off of here as well. Actually, that's an old in-tank fuel pump connector right there. And I've got the old sender connector down there too still. It's a three-way connector. One is the absolute empty switch, which shows a little light on the dash. And then the other two lines are for the gauge needle itself. I'm going to take and splice in two wires here, make it long enough, and run it up through the loom there that I've got going to the back anyways to feed the other pumps. And we're going to get this this wiring hooked up here tonight as well. Before I forget, I did a little bit of thinking overnight as well. And I remembered last year, towards the end of the year, when I was getting ready to put the car away, the speedometer started acting up a little bit. So I'm going to take this opportunity later today to show you underneath the magnetic pickup that I use to run the speedometer signal off of the guibo or the drive shaft flex coupler underneath. And we'll show you how you have that rigged up as well. So what we're going to do here, this tank probably has about, it's probably about half full right now. We're going to go ahead and turn on the fuel pump manually, and we're going to pump out all the gas that we can from inside the tank into a spare gas can over here. Just it's a matter of safety, and don't want to get the fuel all dirty inside there when we're messing around with this. We're going to go ahead and hook up a line to this outlet here and basically have the fuel pump do all the work for transferring this fuel out of the tank. It's pretty full there, so we're probably going to have to use a couple of tanks to get this pumped out here, but we're going to go ahead and start that right now. So in order to turn that fuel pump on manually, we're going to go ahead and pull the relay under the hood here. And the way these relays look, a lot of times you can look around the outside and find the schematic if you don't have it offhand. So what we want to do is connect pins 30 and 87 together. That's on the switch side over here. You flip it over and you see that 30 is right here and 87 is right here. You look at how this is keyed up here. We're going to want to jumper across that line and that line right there. So you can hear the fuel pump running right now. Go back here and check it out. Here we go. Look inside there, you got the fuel pumping right out into the gas tank. You can hear the fuel pump inside this tank and also the pump up there in the swirl tank. So both of those pumps right now run off of the same circuit. Eventually, I think we're going to run out of what's inside the swirl tank over there. It'll be good to get all that gas out of here anyways. If I hear that the swirl tank pump starts running over by itself without any fuel, I'm going to go ahead and just disconnect the wires on it so we don't burn that pump up. So I went ahead and started the engine just so we didn't run the battery down all the way. Figured this would be a good time to explain how the swirl pump and the swirl tank works over here. As I mentioned before, we're basically draining the fuel tank right now through this guy. there is no fuel going into that swirl tank up there right now. But what's good for that is when you're going around the track or you're doing autocross where you're moving around a lot, you got a lot of fuel sloshing around. Basically what happens is the in-tank pump will feed into the swirl tank over there, into that high pressure pump, and that guy constantly cycles fuel back from the engine. The return from the engine goes back into that swirl tank, and then any excess fuel that hasn't been burned coming out of the swirl tank goes back into this return down here. So right now it's just running off the 1.5 liters of fuel that's up in that swirl tank, while the rest of the main tank over here is getting drained. Really no fuel pickup problems with the way I've got this set up. Sometimes guys will run maybe 2 different in-tank pumps here, or even 4 if they're doing rock crawling type things. But for what we're doing with this car, just 1 in-tank pump has been good enough. And this thing will run off of that 1.5 liters worth of fuel for a while. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I'm going to go ahead and disconnect the positive battery terminal here so we don't get any sparks working on these gas fumes and everything back here. Now is a good opportunity to see how the work has held up over the last year. And basically I mounted up this in-tank pump on here, and it's a low pressure but high flow pump feeding into the outlet line over here up to the swirl tank, and that return line goes right back down there to take any fuel right back down to the bottom of this. So one of the things I'll show you inside the fuel cell here in a second, it's got foam baffling in there to keep the gasoline or E85 from sloshing around in there, and there's also a little pickup down in the corner over here. So this sits right down in there like that. When I'm accelerating, pretty much you're accelerating most of the time on the track. In the autocross course, you got a lot of sloshing around in here, but basically I figured in that back corner there was probably the best place to put the fuel pickup. So we're going to take a look down inside the fuel cell here. But basically, that in-tank pump fits right down in the corner there. And what we're going to have to do to get this sending unit to work is we're going to cut a slit in here, and we're going to put a plastic sleeve down in there. Or, now that I look at it, I wonder if I can remove this all together. Nope. So it's one piece up here. But I'm going to cut a slit here, put a sleeve down in there, so this float can go up and down inside the tank there. Really doesn't need much down in there. Just enough to get it there. So that's going to sit right about there, which is about probably 3/4 of an inch off the bottom. Just enough warning there before we start running into fuel pickup issues. Oh, look at that. We might be able to salvage the Made in America sticker right here. And it looks like we have a little dimple there, which could serve as a pilot hole for me. So using my super scientific measuring device here, the width of my finger, the inside of the fuel cell, the plastic part, goes right about there on the inside of these bolt holes around there. So as long as this guy will clear any of those, we'll be in good shape. So I'm gonna probably put her right about there. No wires or anything underneath to worry about. Probably gonna end up right about here. Alright guys, so there she is. The float's installed. You seal up nice and tight against the access panel on the top here. And basically how it works is that float goes up and down based off the fuel level in there. So we're going to go ahead and mount it up, and then we're going to get it wired up. So one other thing I forgot to mention is I was going to put a tube down in there so the float, when it gets all the way to empty, wouldn't get hung up on that foam. But since the piece is already somewhat separated in there like that, I'm just going to cut a square out here to allow that float to sit down in there. When I upgrade to the VDO sensor, it actually has a shield that goes all the way around here, shields the float on that from any other debris in there. And rather than putting a sleeve in there, which could get knocked loose or moving around, I'm just going to cut a square out of this, and that ought to work just fine. All right, guys, so there it is. So float's going to go right down in there. I'm going to mount this whole sending unit back up in here, and we are on our way to reassembly. So we're going to go to 40 inch-pounds on these bad boys here. Alright everybody, we are burning the midnight oil. Only 2 days left here before we leave Friday morning for the trip to Kentucky. So got the fuel access mounted back up. All these guys torqued down here to spec. And what we're going to do now is basically just get all of the tubing and everything hooked back up to where it'll start up again. And then I'm going to go ahead and wire the sending unit for the fuel level up into the original wiring for the gauge up front. And by the time we're done tonight, we want to start the car up and confirm that the fuel gauge reads empty when it's empty. And then as I put all this gasoline back in it that we drained out earlier, we're going to confirm the different levels as it goes up. Something else I did while you weren't looking. Originally I had 2 straight ends on the end of this hose here. When I took it off earlier today, I went and put a 90-degree angle on there, just so like this one down here on the return line. Really just helps with packaging, and it's not sticking up off the top like this. If I got something that hits on it, if I've got some cargo back here, better to have that 90-degree angle on there than not. So ended up finding that in the barn. It's probably something I've had sitting on a shelf for the last 3.5 years, but hey, when we find a good part to use, we're going to use it. Alright, what we're going to do next is put 2 of these bullet connectors on here, because like I said, we're going to go ahead and probably do a better sending unit here at some point in the future. But to have an easy quick disconnect when I go ahead and change that out rather than cutting wires the next time around, we're going to put these on there, and that way we can get them on and off pretty quickly. Alright, we're going to go move inside now, find the connector inside the back of the car there, cut the wires, the connector off, and splice in 2 new wires. We're going to route it back here just like we did with this fuel pump power line here, right up along there, make it look nice and clean up there, and our fuel gauge should be ready to work after that. So just as a matter of making sure we've got the right pin out when we go ahead and do this, cut the connector in there and splice in the new sending unit. This is the original sending unit from the E21. As you can see, it's not a round shape, so rather than just hogging out material and trying to get this guy to work in there, that's why I opted for the cylindrical unit that we put in there. But either way, what we're going to do is we're going to probe these terminals up at the top here. We're going to slide the float back and forth, and we're going to confirm which 2 terminals up here we need to
connect to when we cut off that other connector. The other circuit on this sending unit is a fully empty switch, or a warning switch for the being empty. Basically turns a little light on the dash. So we're not going to hook that up today. We're just trying to find the two wires that have resistance on them. When it is full, when it's empty, it should be about 90 ohms there. When it's full, it should go back down to about 0 ohms. So let's get her to move for us here. And there we go. So that's about 15 ohms up at the top and 90 at the bottom. And just for being complete, we're going to jump her across these two circuits here, and you see you've got no continuity there, nothing. So my guess is this is our ground on the left hand side here, so that would be common between both the resistance line and the switch line, and then we've got that resistance input there and the switched input there. So again, on this connector back here, we said it would be these two wires here that are the fuel sending unit for the level. So when you look at the connector, conveniently I've got a broken shard in here that helps me with the keying on this. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to jumper these two wires here, and that signifies a full tank, and we'll confirm that that gauge goes up to full when I jumper these. And there we go. So she went up to full there, and it's empty now. So for future reference, we've got, as I mentioned before, guy plugs in here like this. So the brown and yellow line is the signal, and the brown line here, which is pretty typical for these German cars, is the common or the ground that you'd see. Alright, now is the moment of truth. I'm going to go ahead and put the fuel back in the tank. And again, as I mentioned before, this one isn't linear. It's got basically switches inside it that change the resistance as the float goes up. So we'll probably see the needle jump up as it goes up, but at least it gives us enough of an estimate of how much fuel we've got left in there. I'm going to go ahead and put in 6 gallons here first. Alright guys, the last thing for tonight. So, like I mentioned before, I wanted to show you where my speedometer pickup is there. So, as you can see, I've got an inductive sensor. And basically, that's out of a 1999 Sonoma automatic transmission. Figuring since I like Sonomas and everything we do on them, I decided, well, why not just start with one of those to see if they work on this this setup here to get that VDO gauge to work. So it's worked pretty good. The only thing that's real finicky about it is if this mount bends on here at all, or something changes in this orientation here and it doesn't pick up the guibo bolts there just right, the needle will jump around, or sometimes it'll flat out turn off. So what I'm going to do here tonight is I'm going to put this guy a little bit as close as I can to where these bolts are going past it, and I'm going to try to tighten it down enough that it doesn't move around on our trip. Alright, so what we did here is we just bent it up a little bit closer there. I don't know if it got knocked out of the way driving it last year or not, but right now she is pretty dang close to the guibo bolt there, and hoping that'll do the trick for us. Otherwise, basically this is just a 2-wire inductive sensor going right into the back of the speedometer, and really ends up wiring up pretty nice. Like I said before, it's kind of a little tricky to get that sensor to pick up just right on there. All right, everybody, it's time to take it for a ride. We're going to take it down to the local gas station, fill her right up, check out the speedometer and how that's working, and pull her back in for the night here. Tomorrow, we're going to put the back seat in there. That's really the last major thing we have to do. And also I want to change the oil. It's probably been a good 2 years since I've changed it in the car. Not that I drive it all that much, but before a long trip like this, I want to make sure we got good fresh oil in there. Alright guys, she is filled right up. No leaks out the top, no leaks out of the new fuel level sending unit there. Put another 4 gallons into there, so at home I was probably about 8 gallons full. And our gauge is reading 100%, which is great. Alright, tomorrow I think we'll be ready to roll. All right, everybody, we're down to the final hours here. So I've got my back seats that have been sitting in the attic for the last, I don't know how long, but good thing I hung on to them for this very occasion. We're going to put them in the back of the car today, and I'm going to do a nice detail on the interior, which means I'll probably pick up that zip tie-in that's been floating around back there for a while. And that'll be it for the interior. Then I'm going to go ahead and change the oil on it. And last night when I took her for a test drive, I noticed the speedometer was still acting goofy. So we're going to check that out one more time here today. One other thing is earlier today, I ran to the hardware store and got some new stainless bolts. So I found that I actually had 2 of those nuts and bolts missing down there. Turbo is all held up nice and sealed now. So basically, as far as under the hood goes, aside from changing the oil before we're all done, that's basically it for anything else we got to do to the motor side before we're ready to go. So I'm going to make a comment on the oil here. So I'm using the yellow stuff here today. High mileage, full synthetic. Typically I've used Rotella T6 in this car, and actually in most of my other cars as well, especially the turbo ones the last few years. But good luck finding it this day and age. So I switched to the high mileage 5W30 on my Yukon, and so far seems like even oil consumption, everything in general seems like it's been good. So we're going to give this a shot here on the E21 on this long trip here. But I've got all the faith in the world that the engine's going to hold up. We'll see how she likes this high mileage 5W30 oil here. The reason why I went with Pennzoil here, because 2 different people that I trust, one being a chief mechanic in the IndyCar series. Actually, I just found out yesterday they all run the Pennzoil full synthetic on their cars in the IndyCar series. So I guess if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. Funny story for you, as I was pouring out the waste oil into the funnel up here, I had a bee flying around my hand, and I was a little worried I'd get stung, and he flew right down the frickin' funnel. I don't know if we're going to see him floating around in there anywhere, but that was certainly something I've never had happen before. Enjoy that used Rotella T6 there, bee. All right, one last thing before we button the hood up here. Conveniently, on the E21, you can fit a quart of oil up underneath here in the cowl. So we're going to put a spare quart of oil up there just in case we need it. I don't think we'll need it because this engine really doesn't burn all that much oil. If anything, it leaks a little bit out of the front, but not enough to be concerning. But just in case, we'll have an extra quart of oil right up here in the cowl on the way. All right, guys, whenever you see something you worked on pulled apart right before the trip, here we are about 15 hours away from leaving. And I took the car for a test drive after changing the oil, and I noticed it was running lean. Didn't really make any sense. Fuel and everything, we've tuned that pretty good. So I noticed the swirl tank pump back here was making quite a bit of noise, which typically indicates that that tank isn't full. And just driving around here probably 4 or 5 miles, and car didn't really stumble at all. It was just running lean. So I get home, and I pulled off the outlet line here. So that's from the in-tank pump up to the filter up there that goes into the swirl tank. And I'm barely getting any flow out of my in-tank lift pump. So it's a it's a low pressure but high flow pump. And I pull it apart, and this is what we've got here. So this guy was just barely hanging on by a thread when I pulled it out, and it cracked off there. So I don't know how long it's been broken, or if it broke when we put it back together and everything back in. So rather than giving up on the whole deal, I looked around in my barn, and I found the old in-tank pump from my E21 tank days. So this is a high flow, low pressure pump right here. Probably not made for E85, but we're only going to be running octane 93 this weekend. So thankfully I've held on to this thing for really since 2008 when I did the M42 swap. And I had a mess of connectors and harnesses laying on the floor. So I found this connector that plugs into the end of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to do a last minute swap of this lift pump, and we're going to hope for the best here. Hopefully we get something that works for us for this trip. All right, guys, we got her mounted up on there, plumbed up through there, and wired up and everything here too. So we're just going to set it down on top of there, make sure we get enough flow out of it. I'm not really looking for pressure out of that. I just want flow into the swirl tank in there. We'll see how that goes. I also plugged it into the battery before I wired it up. It only draws 2 amps, so it's a relatively low current motor on there too. So hopefully the pump's still good. We'll see. Well, guys, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is my speedometer is working real nice. So is the fuel gauge. Bad news is I'm still running lean, and I have no idea why. So when I'm accelerating, it's hitting all of my AFR targets. When I'm doing steady state, for some reason, when I'm just cruising along, it's running lean. So I'm going to hook up the fuel pressure gauge when I get home. Make sure we got good fuel pressure on it. But for some reason, when we're doing just a nice leisurely cruise, she's running real lean. All right, guys, here we are. Day we're leaving. Managed to figure out the lean issue yesterday. At least 2 different options. So I think it's either the dipstick or the oil fill cap, because it started doing that after I filled the oil up. Or in my trunk on the gas tank vent, I had a check valve up on the end of it here in my vent. And I think what was happening is it requires a little bit of vacuum to activate that check valve. So I'm chalking it up to one of those things. I drove it probably about 20 miles last night. No issues. AFRs look good. So we are ready to roll. We're going to do the last finishing touch here before we take her on the road. And hopefully she holds together the whole way here. There we go. All right, everybody, we got Pat and Chris. We're heading down to Louisville. Everything's looking good so far. We're running real nice with the fuel mixture, etc. So life is good, and we are on the road. Nothing better than driving a 40-year-old car in a 1,000-mile round trip. It's like rolling the dice.